workaround.
Michael.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know that this is a president. When he gets punched, he's going to punch back, and whether he should have in this instance or not is a completely separate subject from the response to this hurricane. The reality, as the Congresswoman just said, this is a small island. It was hit by a hurricane and then hit directly by a major hurricane. Communications were put down. Kind of even knowing what needs to get in was challenging for FEMA. I think they did a fantastic job. They are doing a fantastic job. And in the light of a tragedy, and one that we all need to come together and figure out how to deliver both compassion and relief to the people of Puerto Rico, that's where the focus should be on. And there have been, not necessarily from the mayor of San Juan, but there have been a lot of opportunistic attacks on what has been an incredibly difficult and tragic situation, where I think you saw from the FEMA administrator somebody who's doing the absolute best he can.
I certainly agree with that, but do you think it's a mistake, and you haven't heard this for the FEMA administrator, but from the president and from the acting head of DHS, for them to say things are great, we're doing well, when obviously it isn't? Is that just a mistake, and obviously adding to the frustration in Puerto Rico?
Sure. It's obviously adding to the frustration. I think similarly, the president, the head of DHS, and I think you just saw the FEMA administrator, are frustrated at opportunistic attacks when they're doing absolutely everything they can. There was one person who said recently, why didn't they pre-position support and relief efforts in Puerto Rico? Well, where do you pre-position things in an island that's about to get hit by a major hurricane? And so I think there is a frustration from people who are making attacks on them that aren't grounded in the reality of an incredibly difficult logistical situation, and that's causing all sorts of people to say things that they probably shouldn't say.
I want to turn to another story, and that's the resignation late on Friday of HHS Secretary Tom Price after revelations that he spent close to $1 million on either private planes or government chartered planes in dozens of flights in just the few months he's been HHS Secretary. President Trump was not happy. Here he is.
I felt very badly because Secretary Price is a good man, but we are looking into it, and we're looking into it very strongly.
And Price is not alone. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, and VA Secretary David Shulkin have all flown on private or government planes at taxpayer expense. Chuck, how big a deal is this, and how about the fact, as Republicans point out, that various Democrats, when they were in positions of power, did the same thing?
How big a deal is it? I think if we didn't have this big story about Puerto Rico and the NFL and all the other things, this would have been an even bigger story, because it does go right to that perception of the Trump administration, to some extent created by the president himself and his heavy expenditures on Secret Service protection and the travel back and forth to New Jersey, that they're a little loose with the taxpayers' dime when it comes to their own personal comfort. I think it's very significant that the president, axed Tom Price with such speed, because it shows that there was, in a sense, there was some price, pardon the pun, to be paid for what happened on health care. If Secretary Price had really, performed a lot more dynamically and done a more impressive job in trying to get through that health care bill, he might have had more of a purchase on the president's loyalty, which we know is a fleeting thing to begin with. But this firing is also about the fact that the president was upset about what happened on health care, and that's also part of the story and part of the reason it went down so quickly.
Josh, isn't this part of what voters hate about D.C., the idea that public officials are living large on the taxpayer's dime? And I want you to pick up or say whether you agree or not that this wasn't just about the flights in the case of Price, but also the fact that he failed, or at least wasn't seen as being a big player in trying to push Obamacare repeal and replace across the finish line.
Yeah, no, I think there's a good rule in government these days, which is if it feels good, don't do it. Right? In this case, flying across the country and Gulf Streams and everything certainly feels good, and that certainly qualifies as something you don't do. Look, we're in a very populous time, and I think the American people, when you think about traveling of government officials, what they think of is, I'm not going to be happy until they're sitting middle seat next to the bathroom. And the reality is that Secretary Price took this way too far. $1 million of private flights, none of which seem to justify that kind of expense from my perspective. But I think Charles is right. I think this has a lot more to do with his overall standing within the administration and how they felt like the repeal and replace effort was managed from a department point of view.
I'm going to, Michael, in the little bit of time we have left, go post-price, because with the failure of repeal and replace, one of the things that the administration hopes to do is either through regulations or executive orders undo some of Obamacare. One, say what you will about Tom Price, he knew the system pretty well. Is it going to be harder to do that with Price out? And how hard is it going to be to get a new HHS secretary with the battle lines already formed on health care?
Yeah, I mean, Tom Price obviously knew the healthcare system. There's many people who know the healthcare system. I don't think they'll have trouble getting somebody through. The core problem is that most of Obamacare is statutory regulatory authority given to Washington, taken from the American people, taken from the states, and given to Washington. The Republican Party spent 8 years saying it wants to repeal that regulatory authority. What we've learned over the last 9 months is that's actually not true. There's probably 15 or 20 out of 52 senators who want to repeal Obamacare. The challenge President Trump is going to have is finding a way, once we move past tax reform, to get the Republican Party to congeal around a plan that follows through on promises that they would make to repeal Obamacare, which, frankly, the vast majority of elected Republicans don't actually believe in.
Real quickly, one quick answer. You got a candidate for HHS secretary?
You know, I don't. I think you could look at somebody like Ron Johnson in the Senate, who obviously knows health care very well. There's many people on the outside, but I don't have just one name.
All right. It's early. It's just the weekend. Man, that's the way Washington works, right? He's out.